Well, we've been trying to think a bit about what it looks like to be a church that is having an impact in its generation, in its culture, and blessing the people around it, and how to really live that out. And whilst thinking about that, also therefore trying to think how to avoid some of the traps that can ruin that. And the way that we've been thinking about this has been as we've read some of the first couple of chapters of the book of 1 Corinthians in the New Testament, because there Paul is writing to a church that wants to be influential. It wants to be a great church that has an impact in its city of its time. And there's a couple of ways in which they were going wrong, and Paul was speaking to try and help them to kind of recalibrate, to understand what they needed to do differently. One of the things, as they thought about being an influential and a great church, was that they were getting into a kind of celebrity culture, so that their attitude to their leaders was going wrong. And they ended up basically being in groups who were celebrating and almost idolizing certain leaders as the big deals, so that Paul or Apollos or others, that it was all about those characters, and then kind of getting into sort of rivalry and into different factions about this. And Paul has to say to them, you have to remember, what is church? Church isn't about Paul or Apollos or these various other people. Church is about Jesus. A church is a community of people centered on Jesus. And that's one of the things we're trying to really remember and be really focused on, the fact that it's about Jesus. Urban Life is a community of people centered around Jesus. That's what we want to be. That's what we aspire to be. That's by God's grace what we are. But the other thing then was that we noticed how in their desire to be impressive, they were kind of copying and some of the orators, the great people who were, as they thought, who were passing through their city, who would show up and pronounce their great views on everything, their terribly flowery speech, their great wisdom and outlook. And these people were lauded and thought to be wonderful. And that influenced how they thought about how to have an impact, that they thought it was about sounding wise, sounding impressive, and all that kind of thing. And so the second thing that Paul was doing to try and help them, and that we can learn from, is he was trying to say, look, it's not about that. It's easy to think that the way to have an impact is to be super impressive, but he's saying that's not God's way. Very often when you look through the Bible and through history, God works through those who are weak. God works through the unlikely people. God works in ways that are completely different to the ways that we think about things. So that the cross itself is a classic example of that, and even the example, because through the apparent weakness of a Jewish man coming and dying on a Roman cross, the power of God is seen. And the thing is, the people then, and maybe even now, mocked that and thought that was ridiculous. How could you possibly have that as the focus of your faith? How could you possibly think that there was anything powerful in that? And it was saying how people just thought it was a load of nonsense. But through the very things that sometimes the world around might think are nonsense, God's power and might and majesty and life-transforming impact is seen. And that's true then, it's true now. Paul was saying to them, don't think you've got to copy everybody else and be super impressive. Actually, have confidence in God and his ways, and in particular in the power of the message of the kingdom, which is of Jesus coming, dying, being raised to new life in our place and transforming us through that. Have confidence in that. And actually, through those apparently weak ways and an apparently foolish message, the great mighty power of God is seen in people's lives then and now as well.